So I'm so happy to be here. I'm still lucky enough. I've had a few opportunities to have in-person workshops and talks. But I'm still so appreciative of it, of being able to do philosophy. I think the way it's meant to be done, where we're going to be able to go and keep talking about this afterwards. But I'm also happy that there's going to be people who can tune in online, although I should just say my attention is really going to be directed to the people in the room. Okay, so when it comes to the philosophy of disagreement, the epistemology of disagreement, the main question of concern has to do with what's come to be called peer disagreement. And the question is, if you say come to meet somebody who is called your so-called epistemic peer, namely someone who you take to be as knowledgeable as you, as epistemically virtuous as you, having the same kind of evidence, and then you find out that they disagree with you, the question is, well, what should be done by gaining that information? Like, if you've really done your due diligence in coming to have the belief you have, is there a reason to change your belief or to alter your credence when you just find out that someone who's your epistemic peer disagrees with you? Or can you just remain so steadfast, as they say, and keep your belief? Okay, I'm not interested in that kind of disagreement in this talk. In this talk, I'm interested in a different kind of disagreement. That is, when you take it that part of the reason why the person is disagreeing with you is that you think they are not your epistemic peer, right? When you think when you think that the belief they have is clearly false, where they haven't been epistemically virtuous, where they don't have evidence for their belief. The question I'm interested in this talk is what kind of attitude ought you to take towards that kind of person? So say someone who, as I think I have some examples on your handout, right? So someone who thinks the earth is flat, or thinks that that COVID-19 was a hoax, or thinks that there's a cabal of pedophilic Democrats that are running the deep state in the United States. And I think this group has been interested in extreme beliefs, and maybe some of these kinds of beliefs fit into that category that I'm calling fringe beliefs. Now, one of the questions, and something surely that we'll want to talk about more, is like, how do you define this category of fringe belief? I'm just using this term, and we don't want it to just mean refer to a minority view, because we don't want it to include, say, people who were who believed in the heliocentric theory of the universe, back in the 17th century, or to abolitionists in the 18th century in the United States. And it's also not, I don't want it to be, even though I'm going to be talking a lot about conspiracy theories, it's not coextensive with beliefs in conspiracy theories, because some conspiracy theories are true, and they could have good evidence for them. But a lot of the examples are of that kind of that nature. So on your handout again, I give this definition. It's a belief that has a substantial amount of available evidence showing it's false, one that you know or are justified in believing is false. Okay, so that's one of the questions, again, we can talk about this later, is does what gets labeled a fringe belief kind of depend on who's in power or something? Now, it's important, even though this definition I've given is subjective, it has to do with your knowledge and your evidence. There's also this objective element, like it's got to be false, and there's got to be a lot of evidence against it. So if it turned out that the earth was actually flat, it wouldn't actually be a fringe belief. So I'm going to say, I argue in this paper that sometimes there are good reasons to engage with believers of this kind. And, the why, when, and how, sort of, that's what I go through in the talk. First, thinking about reasons why we should engage, but we'll see, maybe we shouldn't always engage, that it might depend on certain contextual factors. So that's the when, right? And then I'm really most interested in the how. And I'm going to argue that we should engage with fringe believers closed-mindedly. So closed-minded engagement is what, it's a term that Jeremy Fantl introduced in his book, The Limits of the Open Mind. And I was really attracted to this idea. He actually thinks, as we'll see, that that closed-minded engagement is very problematic, because it's always going to include some kind of deception and manipulation. And I'm going to try to push back against that. And I'm going to suggest that if we think about the way we engage with each other's emotional life, this will help us, and how when people have problematic emotions, how we interact. This will help us understand how we can engage in this way, in this closed-minded way, without it being problematically deceptive or manipulative. And engage, just to say, what I mean by engagement. I mean, I think as philosophers and as teachers, we have a sense of what it feels like to be engaged. When you feel it, and in a way, one of the things that was hardest about the last couple of years is lacking that kind of engagement, philosophical engagement. And when people got better at it over time a little bit, but like when an online workshop or such would actually generate that feeling, it was like a balm on my numbed mind, sitting there. And so but it includes, like, it tends to include involvement and connection and listening and giving and taking a reason. So that's the kind of thing I'm having in mind when talking about engagement. So again, this is on your handout. This paper, I think, has implications for two very distinct philosophical debates. One, I think it can help us illuminate the nature of belief, something that I'm thinking about and writing about a lot right now. I can talk about that more later. And the lending support for doxasticism, like for the idea that mental states, even when they are very disconnected from the evidence, should still be called beliefs, something that a lot of people are pushing back against. And I think some of what I talk about here lends support for the idea that really these states should be called beliefs. And then also that it's an implication of my view that sometimes engaging in what Peter Strawson calls the objective attitude, taking the objective attitude towards others, doesn't need to constitute a lack of respect. And that's a sort of completely, I think, an interesting implication, or something to talk about that's a little different from issues of belief. Okay, so in thinking about, well, why should we engage with fringe believers? We can just remind ourselves about, well, in general, forget about fringe believers, like why in general do we think it's a good idea to engage with people who disagree with us, right? And here I think we can just go back to Mill's chapter 2 of On Liberty and remind ourselves of what he says there. So, right, that like even if you really, if an opinion is a minority and seems really strange, it might, if you don't engage, it might actually be true and you might lose out on a truth. But then he even says, well, even if you're really sure that it's not true, it could still be good to engage, because then you'll understand your own reasons for believing better, and you'll hold this belief instead of as a lived truth instead of a dead dogma, he says. But you might think, okay, well, those are reasons to engage with like lots of beliefs that I don't agree with. But when it comes to these fringe beliefs, these extreme beliefs, it seems like I don't know if those are great reasons. Another reason in favor of engagement in general is that to not engage seems to constitute a lack of respect, like to just decide, oh, someone's a lost cause and they only hold this belief because they're morally or intellectually inferior, then that seems like you're not respecting them. Okay, but whatever requirement we have, right, in general, to make sure, like, so a lot of those million type reasons are really reasons to kind of make sure our beliefs are okay, right? Like I want to check and make sure I'm believing as I ought to. It's a solitary exercise, right? I'm sort of sitting there figuring out my own belief system and I want to get it right. And I think if that's the way we're viewing it, then there really might not be a lot of reason to engage with fringe believers. If we're sort of just like, sitting there a la Descartes, in our studies, like trying to get our intellectual mind in order, then, maybe not. But I think a lot of theorists these days are really recognizing the social dimension of epistemology, understanding that we rely on each other for our beliefs, right? That this is something like that. If trying to figure out something about my beliefs goes beyond just myself, and I think there's a recognition that, look, these sort of fringe beliefs are becoming more and more widespread. That's why the fringe element sometimes might be problematic. And what they're doing, what it could happen is that the the epistemic community can be in trouble, right? So we maybe want to engage not just for our own sake, but to help increase the health of the epistemic community. So when philosophers do investigate and think about these sorts of fringe beliefs, like for a long time, this might be changing, and maybe your project will help change this. A lot of the material that you get is kind of suggestive material in the blogosphere rather than like fully worked out philosophical pieces. I would sometimes find something and then write to the philosopher and they're like, yeah, I'm trying, I haven't written it yet. It's all I have is the blog. But some of the ideas that come out are like, well, people are attracted to these sorts of beliefs, particularly conspiratorial type beliefs, because they help give them a kind of sense of control. They help people who are feeling very isolated, and then they get to be part of this community and such. And so Lisa Bortoloni and Anna Chino, they have a paper that talks about this, that sometimes it really is protective of people's mental health to have these kinds of beliefs. So I think if we could figure out a way to engage with believers so that we can understand those motivations, and we can increase the epistemic health of the community without decreasing individual mental health, and that would be a very good thing to do. So one thing is, sometimes, as we know, people will profess to have these beliefs when they're just not in good faith at all, right? When they're just doing it to serve their own cause. We've seen so many, we've seen all these so many of the politicians who profess to believe in the rigged election. They don't really believe it. It's just something that they're professing. And so if people are like in bad faith or straight out lying, then there's not going to be reason to engage with those kinds of people, except maybe if there's an audience or something. But that's not, a lot of people who have these sorts of beliefs are not, I think, are quite genuinely believing them without this kind of ulterior motive. So I do think sometimes there are these good reasons, and we should engage with people. Now, this ought, I don't think, is an ought of obligation. I don't think you're obliged to engage with fringe believers, but I do think that it's definitely permissible, which not everyone's sure of. And I do think it's a good thing. I think it can, I think, as I say in the handout, I think it can often exhibit care, and it can potentially lead to a reduction of harm. Okay. So now let's be a little more specific about like what conditions need to be met for it to be for it to be a good thing to do. And so first, here are some reasons why one might think it's not a good idea to engage with fringe believers. Well, the first one is, look, if you really know, like I'm positing, like, the opposite to be true, like, the earth is round, right? So there's this potential problem that if you know something and then you engage with people who disagree with you, you might start questioning and then lose your knowledge. This was what Kripke called the dogmatism paradox, where it seems like sometimes dogmatism, like sticking and not listening to other people, can protect knowledge rather than obstruct it. And that's in Jeremy Fantl's book, The Limits of the Open Mind. He has a very similar view. He's like, even if if you actually know the conclusion of an argument is false, even if you can't kind of figure out exactly what's wrong with the argument, you don't have to engage. And interestingly, Robin McKenna, I don't know, in a manuscript, I don't know yet if it's on its way to publication, but he suggested that the people who are most vulnerable to that kind of lack of knowledge are the very people who tend to be subject of epistemic injustice, and that they surely don't have an obligation to engage with people who disagree with them at risk of losing their knowledge. Another worry is that it could legitimize the view, right? So if you actually like give it its due, this looks like you're taking it seriously. So, if you start engaging with Holocaust deniers, you're like giving some kind of forum for this kind of idea, and that might legitimize it. Now, I think that that worry is most, it comes up most in some kind of like public context, public debate. And I am mostly thinking about private engagement, like interpersonal, individual engagement, where that might not be as much of a worry. And I think a really important consideration has to do with just our limited resources, our limited cognitive resources, the limited time that we have, right? You have to decide, am I going to engage in it? And unfortunately, I think a lot of us have people in our lives who have these sorts of beliefs, and it actually is something you have to think about, and you have to think, okay, is it worth it? Is it worth my time? We're all very busy, and there's only so much cognitive resources that we have. So interestingly, Kassam actually thinks we have an obligation, like much stronger than I do, to engage with these sorts of believers, like say the 9/11 conspiracy theorists. And by the way, when I was talking, I just wanted to say, when I was talking about like how to define fringe belief, he calls them crackpot. Neil Levy calls them bizarre. An NPR article called them bonkers. Okay, so that's okay. So he says even the crackpot views you have an obligation to engage with, and he considers this worry that I just brought up about limited resources. And this is what he says. This quotations on your handout. Like, is it because the question is it at odds with, like, is it asking too much of us to go, check out and the evidence for the conspiracy that 9/11 was an inside job and debunk that? Like, do we need to do that? He says, well, it's certainly at odds with the notion that S can retain her right to be confident that P and her knowledge that P without having to lift a finger. If asking too much of S means requiring her to do something to protect her knowledge, that's true. That's too much is being asked of her. So I think his response is kind of missing the point. It's not whether one has the ability to go out and like find the evidence, and it has to do with it if it's really a good investment of a limited resource. So again, like thinking back to people who are in bad faith or simply lying, or then I think it isn't worth your time. But if you think about, say, someone who you've known a long time, who's a good friend of yours, and who was normally really able to engage in reasoned inquiry, and you were able to have these sort of honest and open discussions, and then during lockdown they're just they're at home all the time, and they're suddenly on the computer all the time, and they get sucked into this rabbit hole, right? Then I think, that in that context, it might really behoove you to spend time engaging with that person. So I listed here some of these factors, right? The background and motives. So like if someone's just motivated to have these beliefs to sort of like help their cause, that's a different thing. The perniciousness of the belief's content and the potential for it to spread. So I think that matters a lot, right? If someone, and we'll come back to this a little later, like if someone has some kind of weird belief and it's so really benign, there isn't really a worry about it, maybe it's not worth the time. But if it's something potentially really dangerous and something that's spreading, then maybe there is. And of course, your relationship with the believer, like, is it someone that you generally do or have a history of being able to engage with? Okay, but whatever kind of engagement I'm talking about is not our typical. When I sort of laid out the model of engagement, of this kind of openness and like kind of took philosophical engagement as the paradigm, right? I mean, the thing about that kind of engagement is it seems like you're always open to changing your mind. So no matter how convinced I am of my view, come to Q&A, right? I'll listen, and I might, be open to changing my mind, at least on some things. But when it comes to engaging with my friend believing in QAnon stuff, I am not open to changing my beliefs to adopt her QAnon ones, but I want her to be open to changing her beliefs to give up those QAnon beliefs, right? So it's this asymmetrical kind of thing. And then someone might wonder, does that even count as engagement if it's this kind of close, is it an oxymoron to talk about closed-minded engagement or this kind of asymmetry? So, I mean, I think if we think about the way that we engage with children, right? So if you're interested in them, you're listening to them, you want to understand them, that's a kind of engagement. We think about our freshman students, right? I don't need to be willing to change my mind about how to interpret a historical text or my view on free will in engaging with a freshman student. But if I'm really like interested in trying to understand them and their views and their reasons, that seems to count as a kind of engagement. So Jeremy Fantl, when he talks about this kind of closed-minded engagement, he gives us a few examples. So he talks about the Listening Project, which is a group that kind of goes into communities and tries to, with the hope of reducing homophobia and racism, and they do this through talking to people, and so like understanding where people are starting from and seeing potential, listening at a very deep level, so that one builds a relationship of trust and respect. And you hear a similar kind of thing, way of talking with Christian Piccolini, who was an ex-neo-Nazi, and he goes around and talks to people who are, and with the hope of getting them to change their mind. And he says, you can scream and use facts against someone who's not thinking rationally. You'll never change their mind, no matter what you say. We have to understand the motivation of why people hate. So this is this sort of emphasis on empathetic listening and trying to understand the person. And in this context, some of the worries about like losing knowledge don't really apply, because you're not really the emphasis is, as I say here, is on the believer and trying to understand the believer rather than the belief. So you're not at risk, as much risk of losing confidence in your own belief. I mean, this paper is called Engaging with Fringe Beliefs, but it's interesting when I'm really talking about engaging with fringe believers and thinking about what difference that might make. Okay, so I mean, as I mentioned earlier, even though this was Fantl's idea and I like it, right? He really worries about it because he thinks, well, the only way that it works, right? And it does work, like they have results, because the only way it works is if you're not honest, if you don't present yourself as closed-minded as you are. He says, if you present yourself as open, or at least fail to emphasize the degree to which your mind is closed, if you are in fact closed-minded, you can easily be problematically insincere. Okay. So, and the examples I gave of children and students, right? This might think, well, this necessitates a kind of problematic paternalism or condescension or something like this. And it might seem like, you're in this kind of engagement, you're adopting what Strawson called the objective attitude, right? That you're, again, this is on your handout, that you're viewing someone as a subject of social policy, as a subject of what, in a wide sense a wide range of sense might be called treatment, to be managed or handled or cured or trained, rather than the participant attitude, which is essential to ordinary adult relationships. So is it the case that this kind of closed-minded engagement means that you have to take that kind of attitude? As I say here, my answer is a qualified yes. But one thing that's really important to note about that piece, Freedom and Resentment, where Strawson introduces these two kinds of attitudes, even though they're often taken as dichotomous, he's really clear that even though, I mean, I think I might even have this, he says, I must deal here in dichotomies and ignore the ever interesting and ever illuminating variety of case, okay? But he's clear that there are times when, even in full-fledged adult relationships, you can take up the objective attitude. He says it's compatible with viewing the person as normal and mature. So now I want to think about, well, what does that look like? What does it look like to take this engage closed-mindedly in a way that doesn't degrade into a kind of problematic disrespect or condescension or such. And this is where I think that thinking about the model of how we try to alter emotions can be extremely helpful. Okay, so again, Fantl says, look, if he considers this other method called nonviolent communication, where some Martin Rosenberg advocates for, where there is a little more forthcomingness about where you're starting from. Right? It's kind of clear that you're not agreeing with the person. There's something going on with that, but Fantl says, well, it's just not going to work, right? Like the degree to which, like the more open you are, the less likely you're going to be able to convince the other person. Okay, so, but when I read about that nonviolent communication, what it really sounds like is that what you're trying to do there is get the person to be less defensive, get the person to be more open, be able to sort of have this space where they might be open to hearing you. Because normally, like if you just kind of slam a bunch of facts on someone, they get very closed and defensive. So it could be that you're not trying to convince the person by confronting them with this direct confrontation of facts, but you're trying to have a kind of indirect route through mutual understanding to create this openness. So if we're thinking again about emotions, I mean, and how when we think that an emotion is, say, problematic, and the different ways that emotions can be problematic and the different ways that we can go about altering our emotions. So, I mean, certainly emotions are, when we say that one way an emotion can be problematic or irrational or such, is if it's not fitting, right? If there's no fitting related reasons to have it. So if it's a foggy day and there's a crash and my boat crashes against the shore and I get really angry at my neighbor who I think carelessly hit the boat with their boat, then the fog lifts and there's no neighbor there, well, then my anger will go away because say the wind was just the wind, it wasn't the neighbor. And if it doesn't, there's, I'm certainly blameworthy, right? There's no fitting object to be angry at, okay? But let's just say I was right and it was my neighbor did carelessly hit my boat. There might be another kind of criticism of my anger. Maybe I'm working hard, I have a disposition to get angry too quickly, and I'm working hard to alter this disposition, right? And I didn't do it, and I didn't act as I wanted to. I didn't have the kinds of feelings that I wanted to. Well, then that's another kind of way that my emotion could be problematic. But emotion theorists tend to be more comfortable with recognizing that there can be both fitting related reasons, like no object of anger there, and also these more value related reasons, like it's not good for you to be angry, and that those can both be reasons for you to change your attitude. But of course, we know that nothing that you say to someone when they're angry, like, is going to immediately pointing out evidence. Oh, look, there's no, whatever it is that you do isn't going to immediately change the emotion, particularly in the second kind of case, right? It's not impossible to change your emotions, but it's going to take some time. It's going to take more of a nuanced communication than just like giving someone a whole bunch of evidence. Often it's going to be that way. Okay. So there are times, just I say here, put it simply, evidence does not immediately affect feelings. Okay. So at times, right, when someone's in a certain kind of emotional state, it could actually be really inappropriate to start engaging in a reason, evidence-y kind of way, right? It's sometimes okay to recognize that we're also part of the causal order, as Langdon says, it's cogs in the grand machine of nature. And sometimes I think that that's what actually is required for respect. So Mark Schroeder has an interesting paper called Persons as Things, where he makes a case of this kind, and this is a quotation from him, because persons are in fact a kind of thing, it should not be surprising if the participant stance, the perspective par excellence from which we engage with one another as persons, does not preclude prediction, interpretation under a causal lens, or even perhaps at least some kind of management. And he has the example in that paper of coming home and his wife snaps at him for not trimming the vines properly. And then he thinks, well, he knows she's been really having a rough time at work and was really like up late at night, and so she's tired and stressed, and that's how he explains her snapping, right? So he's interpreting her under this causal lens, but that doesn't seem to be bad, right? And he says, well, maybe if I did that all the time, it would be bad, but certainly in this sort of case, I'm not doing anything wrong. And I want to go further and even say sometimes, like if in that kind of case you do start engaging in this kind of very reasoned kind of way, that constitutes a kind of disrespect. You're not seeing someone for who they are at that moment. So it applies for emotional state, like irritation or lashing out, actions like lashing out, I think also applies to beliefs. And we have this kind of, and the thing about these beliefs that we're thinking about is they're beliefs that are often end up being very tied to identity, there's a strong feeling to these beliefs. So I think a really interesting case of how recognizing the causes, like treating someone under this rubric, this causal rubric, can actually humanize them, was given by this, it was last year, this Stuart Thompson, this New York Times reporter. He spent a whole lot of time listening to QAnon chat groups, and this is what he says. Beneath the anger in their voices is often pain or confusion. When the chat dies down to just a few members, they'll share stories about their struggles with affording health insurance or the shame of going on government assistance. Hearing them talk with one another, I could start understanding the pull of conspiracy communities, how they exploit the vulnerable and create a worldview out of shared enemies. Then you watch those views harden. And while none of it excuses participation in a dangerous collective delusion, it takes the complex process of radicalization and gives it a human dimension. So this is exactly the kind of case where someone was humanized, right, by adopting that kind of causal lens. Now, thinking about these sorts of beliefs, like what's different or special about them as opposed to other kinds of beliefs? In this other, see, it's kind of amazing. In the last year, there's been so many op-eds with talking about like epistemic corruption and such. Like the word epistemic has come into so many different op-eds. So there's this guy in the Financial Times writing about this, and John Thornhill, and he said, we cannot reason people out of beliefs they have not reasoned themselves into. Okay, but okay, so but the thing is, he didn't quite get that right, because most of our beliefs we don't reason ourselves into, right? Most of our beliefs are like, based on perception or memories that we can't recall, or testimony that we can't recall, right? What he meant was, I think, that most of our beliefs, even if they weren't reasoned into, can be reasoned out of, right? But most of our beliefs are reason responsive. They are vulnerable. They have evidential vulnerability, right? So sometimes it's just super easy to do that, right? Most of us grew up thinking that Pluto was a planet, and then sometime we were told it wasn't, and we didn't really quite understand, but we're fine. Okay, it's not a planet, right? So this is the case with most of our kinds of beliefs. But these beliefs, these fringe beliefs, are very resilient, right? They seem to hold on despite the evidence. Okay, but again, they're not the only kinds of beliefs that are like that. So it could be that our belief that there's a world of external objects, that might be a belief that no matter what, the evidence seems like whatever evidence comes up against it, like we're still going to really hold on to it because it's so important and central to our our way of living, to our meaning making. Now, one might say, but look, we don't have a whole bunch of evidence against that, whereas with the conspiracy and fringe beliefs, we have a lot of evidence against them. But I do wonder, and I just happened to see this article in Wired about living in another one, more recent one, about living in a simulation, and Dave and Chalmers' book. Like if the evidence started mounting that we are actually in a simulation, like it would take a while for us to be able to accept that evidence, right? When something is really central and crucial, around which so many other beliefs hinge, right? It's really hard to give it up. Thinking about fringe beliefs, I think it's helpful to think about religious and superstitious beliefs, right? That seem to be, don't have the same relationship with the evidence that a lot of factual beliefs do. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people think that's a reason to say that religious beliefs or religious cognitive attitudes are not actually beliefs, because they don't seem to be responsive to the evidence in the same way as ordinary factual beliefs. They don't seem to be connected to action in the same way as other beliefs. Now, I'm on the side of like thinking about them as beliefs, but that's partly a lot of my motivation for that is I think it's important for us to be able to, for two reasons. I mean, I think it's important, for us to not kick out too much from the belief family. Like a few other people are noticing this, like all the non-doxasticists, we have one in our here, right? We're in danger of depopulating the category of belief. And I also think, especially as epistemologists, like we want to be able to keep them as beliefs so that we can think about them, assess them, normatively, make distinctions between them. And it's just all like not beliefs, then they become out of that purview. And so I have a worry about that. So in I asked a bunch of my friends to give me a list of some superstitious beliefs they have, because we all kind of, like a lot of us go to, think we have to wear a certain jersey when we go to a sports event, right? Or we think it's like bad luck if it's to say, oh, the weather is so nice, it's not going to rain, right? Or oh, the traffic is so smooth. I'm like that. Don't say that. So I asked my friends, what are some superstitious beliefs you have? And this is just some list. Sneeze or stumble on the way out, and whatever was being planned will turn out poorly. When flipping a coin, heads, one should make the conservative choice. Tails, take the risk. It's bad luck. These were a whole bunch of them. They're always bad luck. Split a pole, hang laundry on New Year's Day, not salute magpies. It's good luck to say rabbit, rabbit, rabbit the first day of the month. Tap your dashboard 7 times before a road trip. Make a wish on a shooting star, and avoid scratching the itch on your right palm. Right. So somebody again might say, well, these aren't really beliefs, maybe, because do people really stop having them when it doesn't correlate to the bad luck or good luck or such? And again, what I just said, I think is important, not to be too quick to eliminate, to kick out beliefs. And I did ask people specifically to give me some of their, tell me some of their superstitious beliefs. And a lot of these people are academic philosophers, by the way. Okay. So, but I think what is telling about it, and here is maybe what I've come to think is maybe the most important, but one of the important things about this, about my idea in this paper, is that a lot of my friends who said this, they said they gave these beliefs, but they were kind of embarrassed about them, right? They kind of recognized that they were a little, they wrote, I think I was on a social media, and they're like, there was a recognition that they weren't just like their other ordinary beliefs. They understood that. And I think part of the problem with these sort of fringe believers is they're not seeing these beliefs as being different from their other evidence-based beliefs. They're taking them as being just as well grounded, well evidentially grounded as others. They're not thinking, but like even, I'm in Antwerp right now talking a lot with Neil Van Leeuwen, and like, it's interesting that a lot of religious believers will kind of think about their beliefs a little differently than their other beliefs. But a lot of people who believe these kinds of fringe beliefs, these kinds of conspiracy type beliefs, they don't see them that way. So I think like one of the hopes is that in the kind of engagement I'm encouraging here is to get people to begin to see their beliefs differently. So Rick mentioned, right, and I mentioned very in passing, that I think that sometimes there can be good value-related reasons for believing, right? These broadly practical reasons for believing. And I think sometimes we can recognize that even. And I've written lots of papers to try to explain that to try to defend this view that there could be practical reasons for believing. When I mean practical, I like the value-related belief reasons title that kind of makes it a little more clear what I'm talking about. So if I say believe that humanity is generally good, and I believe this because it helps me be more cheerful, and charitable, right? I can recognize that. I can see that as one of the reasons I believe it. I can endorse it. Whereas someone who has one of these fringe beliefs, for them to say, well, I think that the vaccine is the COVID vaccine is Bill Gates trying to control us through 5G, right? They can't say, and one of the reasons I believe that is because it gives me a sense of community and comfort. Right? So I think it's a really interesting difference, right? When you can have a belief and you can recognize that part of it at least is grounded in these value-related reasons, and when you can't. So this is the sort of the last paragraph on your handout. The main goal of engaging is to get people with fringe beliefs to recognize that some of their beliefs are different and less reason responsive than other beliefs they hold. And then I don't mean this just to be like them. I think it's something that we all should do more, is be willing to do the same, recognize which of our beliefs are less open to question, less responsive, or grounded in evidence. And then we can ask why there's that special status. So I'm just going to read my conclusion here. So when engaging with others, there's a range of ways to relate between fully collaborative inquiry and adopting a wholly objective stance. As we persist in finding ways to engage with those who hold fringe beliefs, I propose that we use this mixture of participant and objective attitudes, kind of like we do with irrational notions, bringing empathy and respect to engagement while rejecting ideas that are false and dangerous. This mixture of engagement, I think, is crucial to improve the epistemic health of the community. So I've argued that one has good reasons to engage closed-mindedly with people who hold fringe beliefs when, one, the cognitive and emotional costs of doing so are not too high, and two, such engagement has the potential to lead to a change of view. I attempted to assuage the concern this kind of engagement must involve problematic deception and manipulation. While such engagement differs from the mere asking and giving of reasons or evidence for beliefs, it does not treat the believer as incapable of such rational discourse. That's something I didn't get into. It's not like you can't talk about evidence, but I skipped over to try to keep in time. Throughout my discussion, I've assumed that at least many people count as fully believing these propositions, even though they are highly resistant to the evidence. This seems like an uncontroversial assumption since they are widely labeled and treated as belief. Yet, as I said, many epistemologists have suggested that attitudes that fail to appropriately respond to evidence or to result in the kind of behavior typical or expected of belief are not actually beliefs. I hope the foregoing discussion has helped to highlight the problematic implications of such a restriction. If epistemology focuses on some special subset of beliefs at the exclusion of delusions, religious faith, political convictions, if they're not the proper subjects of epistemic evaluation, then many other intuitively irrational and unjustified beliefs, such as those that are the focus of this paper, will also be excluded. But something's gone wrong if epistemology is no longer concerned with investigating and evaluating such beliefs. Thanks.